All right, let's start this. All right, my talk is titled "With jQuery and CakePHP to World Domination." So I'm trying to introduce you to some of the stuff I found useful when combining jQuery and CakePHP together. And at the end of the talk, I'll also present you a little framework I'm currently working on, and which I wanted to release today, but it's not quite ready, but good enough to show some of the stuff that's already working. All right, about me. Well, as you can see here, I'm slightly crazy sometimes, and I like squirrels. But no, seriously, I'm 20 years old. I come from Germany. I consider myself a blogger, programmer, / entrepreneur these days. And I use jQuery and CakePHP in pretty much all battlefields. This means a few in-school projects for small business websites, and I even had the chance to work on one of the largest CakePHP applications, which has over 300 database tables. And I found both CakePHP and jQuery handled the situation extremely well, and so they've grown to become my favorite tools for web development. All right. Some of you might know that I'm running a web blog called ThinkingPHP. Well, what is it about? It's basically a blog about CakePHP. I also talk about some other stuff. In some of the posts, I go deep inside of the CakePHP core, as you can see here. And well, sometimes things just seem to go wrong for me. But don't get scared by that. All right, back to the topic, world domination. Well, I actually prepared myself a little bit for the talk, and I read up on some of the current literature on the topic. There's like Coup d'etat and by Edward Luttwak. There's 1,000 Steps to World Domination. And well, quite recently, Stu released with his latest masterwork, Stu's Guide to World Domination. So if you ever plan to take over the world, there's good information out there. And well, I also read on some of the empires that try to achieve world domination so far. And it turns out it's quite a few, but they kind of all failed so far. Well, I made a list anyway, so we see who's the competition. And surprisingly, of all those empires, there's actually two exceptions to the failing empire thing. Well, it's PHP Nut and Chuck Norris. They're still around. But they're an exception to the rule. We're not going to cover them today. So I really believe the next big empire is going to be that one. And I'm going to tell you why in just a little bit. Well, first of all, let's do a little quick battle analysis of what we're dealing with here. And I want to start out by some of the problems some of you might have already run into when using jQuery and CakePHP projects. And one of the first ones is there's no jQuery JavaScript help available. That means for those of you who are not quite into JavaScript yet and want to get something up quick and get something up real quickly, then you have to get your hands dirty yourself, and there's no help where you can just drop in. Well, there's also no manual on using jQuery and CakePHP. You might find some scattered blog posts with some suggestions. I even have some really crappy ones on my blog. And but there's no real starting point if you're new to all of this. And there's not really a jQuery / CakePHP framework, except there's a thing called Jadm, which is an MVC framework. But I didn't have the time to study it fully yet, but it looks quite good as well. So if you want to play around with different technologies, yeah, it's actually written by this guy over there. So, and I know he would have killed me if I wouldn't mention it. So.
Did you find out about it while you were here?
No, I found out about it before, but I kind of tried a similar approach to handling JavaScript before, and it failed pretty badly for me. So I assumed that maybe I was too stupid, or it's just not my way of like working with JavaScript. But if you're really hardcore MVC, then it might be the best thing to try out Jadm and see how it goes, and compare it to what I'm going to show you right now. All right, so with all those problems mentioned, why would you want to use jQuery anyway? Well, jQuery embraces succinct code. This means if you have checked out Yahoo or Dojo, you're going to find they're all about namespacing and like making really long function calls and long function names, and you're more typing the entire time than actually doing stuff. And well, jQuery is all about write less and doing more. And so that's one of the greatest features of jQuery. There's also a huge number of jQuery plugins out there, which is not to underestimate. So you can go out there and there's virtually hundreds and hundreds of good solutions to common problems that you can just plug in. And well, jQuery plays really nice with other libraries. If there's another library occupying the dollar space, like for example prototype, then jQuery is capable of renaming itself, and you can still use it, just calling it something different like $J or something like that. So it's really good for like existing projects where you have to deal with legacy code, and most of the libraries out there aren't so flexible. So, well, why would you use CakePHP? Okay, just kidding. Well, actually, there's something new I want to talk about for a second. There's a new server out there that's called Jadm. How many of you have heard of it? Quite a few, yeah. HX Mark has heard of it. And, well, Jadm is a completely new web server. It's some hack of the Apache web server with a Firefox JavaScript engine. And what it does, it allows you to write entire web applications in JavaScript. For example, it has support for MySQL, SQLite, SMTP, and file system access. So that's the stuff we're usually dealing with when writing a CakePHP application. And another thing is the server process kind of seems to stay alive. That means you actually have a stateful application. Your server is in the same state that your client is in. And that's a totally new ballgame, because we are used to using CakePHP, which never knows what's going on the client. We kind of have to find out what is the client doing, what's the server doing, and as soon as you get into real heavy Ajax, that can become a problem. With Jadm, you kind of avoid this problem. And well, another big advantage is you don't have to wear two hats. It's all JavaScript. You don't have to deal with another server-side language for all your code. So you could learn one language really well and kind of forget about all the other stuff you have to deal with normally. But I don't think Jadm is quite ready for any serious usage yet, and there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, no Linux version. I mean, come on. That's not going to help you guys a lot because you're not deploying on Windows or Mac OS, and so no Linux version really hurts. They're working on it and probably coming out in the next couple months, but that's reality right now. The other thing is nobody knows if this will scale. I mean, the server process seems kind of to be staying alive. That means what happens if you have 1 million concurrent users? Do you have like 1 million processes? I mean, this stuff is a little scary. I'm not quite sure how they handle it, but it's not known if it will scale so far because nobody's really using it. And the other thing is there's no real framework to it yet, so you kind of will start writing spaghetti code. Not because necessarily Jadm is bad, but because nobody has shown you a way of how to really utilizing it. So one good point about it, though, is you can combine it with any server-side language you use. Jadm works by taking your HTML document and looking for server-side JavaScript includes, and it will execute them. So you could theoretically generate those with CakePHP. And that might be an interesting thing to play around with when you have some free time. But so far, let's focus on the basics again. And that would be, let's take over the world. And before we take over the world, we got to get some stuff done. One of the things a lot of you have probably done so far is including JavaScript in your CakePHP applications. And in order to do that, there are several ways. What I'm going to start showing you is how CakePHP tells you to do it. And it's quite easy. First of all, you create a controller. Can everybody read that? It's a little small. It's basically just an empty controller with an empty index function, and it includes a JavaScript helper. Yeah, I think that helps. And then you have a view where you basically link to a JavaScript file. I'm using jQuery as an example here. And the second parameter, false, doesn't place the link in the current view, but it adds it to the class registry, which will later on make it available to our layout. And that's seen right here. In the layout, we can now say echo script for layout, and it will have all the scripts that were previously included in views. So This way we can have a view-based inclusion mechanism and include all our JavaScript files in the head element anyway, so they're loaded before our document loads, which is quite nice. So that's what I call the quick and easy way to do it. And for really small applications, this works quite well. All right, problems you'll run into. The big problem is this approach is not try. What do I mean by this? Try stands for do not repeat yourself. And in our case, this means if we have like the same JavaScript file included in 3 different views, for example, in the comments index, the post index, and the users index, we have a jQuery ratings JavaScript file included, then there's there's a real problem, because what if we want to rename this JavaScript file? We now have to go through all the references to it and rename it. So we do that. We could rename it into hurt feelings instead of ratings. But that's not really try. We want to keep things in one place. So it's not only not try, it's also a little confusing. Because, look, if you have a big application with lots of JavaScript, can anybody tell me what JavaScript has been included from what view and where all of this stuff is coming from and why a certain JavaScript file is missing? It's confusing. And so the question is, where the fuck do those includes come from? And that's why I personally dislike this approach, because as your system becomes bigger, this approach kind of gets messy. And that's why I'd only recommend it for quick and easy applications. All right. How to kiss this? Kiss in terms of keep it simple, stupid. Well, the main idea we should follow is having a central place to define all our JavaScript includes. Then we'd have only one reference to each JavaScript file, which is an obvious advantage if we want to rename things. And the last thing is, let's use some simple rules for the inclusion on a per action basis. Well, what do I mean by this? Let's look at the following example. This is a config file. We could place an app/config jsincludes.php. And what we do there is simply define a list of JavaScript files we use in our document, and then we add a series of rules on when to include it. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the first example. We want to include jQuery. jQuery is our Swiss Army knife. We want to have it everywhere. So $:* means included for all controllers and all actions. Well, then we have, even have an explanation for it. Okay, then we have the jQuery rating plugin. Now, we don't want to include this everywhere. In this case, we only want to include it in all view actions, in all user actions, with the exceptions of user index. So it's basically a chain of simple commands or rules on how to include stuff. So this says all controllers, this says view, so include it for all controllers for the view action. This says do the same for all user actions, but exclude the user index action. This gives us a lot of flexibility, because now we have one central place where we can define what JavaScript files to include where. Same goes for the last example. We include dimensions.js in all actions except admin actions, because we don't need it there. And this is a simple system, and we can feel quite comfortable when we add new JavaScript files and need to distribute them amongst different views. If you're interested in it, this is the actual PHP function that does this rule parsing. If you want to download it, just Google for 33 lines of magic code. I published it on my blog once, but I should publish the refactored version also, because it's like 20 lines now. And I'm also going to mention a little bit of the details of this function in my talk tomorrow, Jadm, because it can also be used for write management. So you can use it to do simple ACL stuff. That's what it originally was meant for. And this is the solution I call the flexible, because it gives you a lot of control. And one of the things I discussed with Timo is, in really big JavaScript applications, you often end up not having like 20 includes, but you have some package mechanism where you include all JavaScript files at once. So once you get to this point, you have to decide if what you want is like big JavaScript files that download fast, or if you still want to have the control of fine-graining what gets loaded where. All right.
The problem, for instance, I have
with Jamal is that I can do something like a request action call from one controller to another. So there was a solution that I say, okay, I have controller users and it's the method I don't know, login. So I know I just include the user model, the user controller, and the user view in Jamal. But on the other hand, there could be something like request action, so I have to include all. So I just, put it all together in one file and obfuscate it or use the network spectre to make it smaller. And it's just one file now.
Yeah.
Because it was the easiest way for me, and I don't have to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, one of the cases where what I do in my application, for example, is I have the following rule. If less than 50% of all JavaScript get included, then I include each file individually, which, for example, is the case when people hit the main page. I believe there's only jQuery included, and so the main page comes like snappy. And when they then log in, and more than 50% of the JavaScript is included, I have a bundled version that contains all the JavaScript, and I have a mechanism to automate that. If any of you is interested in how that works, just catch me after the talk, and I can show you some of that. Another technique I use for including JavaScript is what I call automatic JavaScript inclusion, and it's pretty simple. Basically, whenever I load a view, I check, is there a JavaScript file in app/webroot/js/views/layout, and then the name of the layout.javascript. So what this does, it's basically a simple way of having one JavaScript file for each layout loading dynamically, so you don't have to worry about it. I do the exact same thing for views. So I check in the views folder for subfolder controller, and then a file with the name of the view. And if it exists, I simply include it. So if you need, at any point, you decide this view needs like some special JavaScript, you just drop the file in there, and it will be loaded automatically. It's very convenient for fast development. Yeah?
Like with this method and the last method, for specializing files for certain actions and stuff like that, that wouldn't really be dry either, would it? Because you'd have functions that you would need twice, and you'd be copying the code.
Yeah, if you need it in two places, I use the inclusion mechanism I showed first.
Yeah.
I only use it if it's like something totally specialized for this one view. If it's something that repeats, I include it via the rules-based inclusion mechanism. So, yeah, guys, please, if you have any questions at any point, interrupt me. I'm really happy to answer them. Another thing that I found myself needing is sometimes you have like an array in your PHP controller, and you want to make this array available to JavaScript. Because, well, ideally, your web application should be accessible without JavaScript, but sometimes you don't need to follow that requirement, or sometimes you even can't, and then you directly need to pass stuff from PHP to JavaScript. Well, the way I do this is by using a function like this. This is what I call setJSON. It essentially works exactly like the set function, from the app controller, what's inherited by a controller. And what it does is the following. First of all, it checks if in the view was there's already a JSON was set. If that is the case, then it populates this local function variable with a value of it, and if not, it starts with an empty array. Then if the first parameter that's being passed in is an array, then what I simply do is I loop through all the elements in the array and add it to the JSON wars by using the keys. So this is what you use when who's familiar with passing in parameters using compact to the set action. Yeah, some of you. Yeah, I'm going to have that in the CakePHP talk tomorrow as well. That's when usually this function is being triggered. And in the case that we simply have a string as the first parameter and anything else as the second, we directly set it like that. And then we basically pass this back to the view was. I could have used view was directly. But anyway, what this does is you have the second Z function that you can use for things you want to pass to JavaScript and not to the view. Essentially, you pass it to the view as well, but I'm going to show you what I do with it. So what do I do with this function if I, for example, want to make a list of posts available in JavaScript? Well, it's easy. Let's say I have a post controller like this, and I fetch some posts from the database. Then all I need to do is, in order to get it to the JavaScript, is by using this setJSON. Actually, yeah, get some arrows for that. Sys set JSON post, and then I set the post variable. This will execute the function I just showed you. Then what happens is this is what you need to put in your layouts file in the head section, and it essentially just checks, is there a view variable called JSON_was_set, and if so, then generate some code for this view variable. Essentially what it does, it takes the JSON bars, it encodes it as JSON. This is what JavaScript object does, and then it sets this in a JavaScript variable, which I call JSON_was. And then I simply output this in a code block. So once I've done this, I can now use this code in JavaScript. So I can, for example, do a loop where I loop through all JSON_was.post, and then I can alert the title of the post. So it's a quick and easy way to get my PHP objects and variables to JavaScript and use them in there. If you have a bigger application, you might want to namespace this a little bit more, but other than that, it should work in most applications. Yeah, just a quick recap. What you need in order to use this is the set JSON function, put it in your app controller. Then you write your post controllers like this, and instead of set, you use set JSON. And that's what you put in the head section of your layout, which essentially passes the stuff to JavaScript. And that is how you access the stuff in JavaScript. I'm going to make the slides available, so you can get it from there. All right, I lost track. Back to the topic, world domination. What should we expect from world domination? Well, here's the application I'm currently working on, and I'm going to show you a little bit how the UI works, so you get a little bit of a feel of what can be accomplished using extremely custom JavaScript. Is an hour already over? Okay. I'm scared.
Quite past 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, essentially what happens here is it's a task management application, and we just added a task, and it's completely being added to the DOM dynamically. It's sent to the server via JSON, and it even has some other stuff going on. We can also use, for example, drag and drop and associate a task with a context. We can update our progress on the task. And we can edit the time estimate we have for the task. And so that should give you a little context when I'm speaking about the stuff I'm going to show next, because it's not really for standardized applications where the same screen elements show up over and over again. This is if you want to build applications where you're really particular about how things should look, how the JavaScript should work, and what the user experience will be. And so basically, if you want to go really custom, those techniques will help you. Just a little bit about the project, because I'm going to use some examples from it. Well, it's all about personal time management. So essentially, you log on and you put in your hours and your tasks that you want to do on a certain day, and we'll keep track of it all. And what it will help you with is if the day approaches afternoon, it will tell you could be done by, let's say, 8 p.m. And that if that's too late for you, you can reschedule stuff, you can change estimates, and it helps you to achieve a stress-free life by simply not having a to-do list that you cannot really know how much the stuff is going to be, and you always find yourself with things left at the end of the day. So next step we're going to do is we're going to become the best project management tool. That's our big goal, but we start with your personal time, because I think that's important, to not start with a big project, but to start with you in your everyday life, your days and how you manage the time there. And, well, after that, world domination, of course. Okay, what I really want to talk about, Jadm. Jadm is a JavaScript library that I'm working on. And what is Jadm? Well, Jadm has to do with microformats. How many of you are familiar with microformats? 3? Okay, going to explain a little bit about them in a second. Well, Jadm's not only about microformats, it's essentially about microformats on steroids. So, well, besides using microformats and illegal substances, there's always also some MVC present in Jadm. You have the model, you have the view, and you have the controller. Well, in Jadm, I follow the following philosophy. My model is my HTML and DOM document, meaning I don't have any JavaScript objects holding the state of my client. I really represent the state of my application in the document. There's a lot of advantage to that, and I'll come to them in a second. The view is, as many can imagine, the CSS that you use, and the controller is the JavaScript. All right, about microformats. Basically, for those of you who don't know what it is, microformats are a collection of standardized HTML snippets. What's so cool about standardized HTML snippets, you'll ask? Well, what you can achieve with them is that spiders, any kinds of robots going through the web, can find those microformats, detect them, and extract your information. That means the semantics in your document are actually useful. Some applications to that are, for example, hcard, which is a microformat describing people, meaning if you have like a set of records expressing like contact information, then hcard is what you would use, and any spider coming to your website could read it. Like a recard, yeah, but just expressed in HTML. Well, then there's, for example, rel license, if you need to express licensing information in the document. There's address for address information, and geo for location stuff. And I believe the later two are on hcard. If you want to have more information on that, go ahead and check out microformats.org. It's actually pretty cool stuff. So what's special about Jadm microformats? Well, usually those are non-standardized formats, and they are custom to your application. They can change as the application evolves. That means they're not really fixed and by any means written down and documented. And you probably are already using them. Let me show you why. So this is an example from PostTask, and it's basically a record in a table that's expressing a task. That's the stuff you saw being added and dragged and dropped early on. Well, let me explain this microformat so it makes some sense. One part of this microformat is, for example, the task ID. It's encoded as the ID of the table row element. Then the task.date is encoded as a rel attribute. There also is a progress on the current task, which is 0 in this case. There's a time done, which is dependent on progress. There's a time total, which means that's your time estimate for the task. And then there's a task.name, which is the name of your task. And all of this information is encoded in the HTML. That means the advantage to that is you don't need it anywhere else. You can directly read it out of the HTML, which is what I call microformat input-output. In order to read data from our microformats, we obviously need to parse it, because as you saw, it's like all hidden in the HTML, and while you can see it, it's still a different thing of actually having it in a clean JavaScript variable. And if we want to update our data, we also need to be able to write to the microformat. So let's start by looking at how can we read our own microformat in the DOM. Well, this is an example out of the task row. It's simply a link that is used for the progress bar, and it contains several classes. The class progress tells us this is the link showing us the progress bar. It's being styled as a little box with a little green background going up and down. Then there is the progress is actually encoded, and the time done is as well. All right. Let's say we want to have the task.progress, and we want to extract it from our microformat. How can we do it? Well, this is the JavaScript that can achieve it. Let's run through it a little bit, because it's not quite trivial. So the first thing we do is we create a new variable, and we call it progress. Then we call the function parseInt, which is essentially the same as a typecast to an integer in PHP. That means whatever we are going to return, it's going to be an integer. Then we're going to find the task we're interested in using the task ID, and we're going to find the progress element, which is that up there. Now that we've done that, we're going to extract the class. the class is up here, which is simply a string progress space progress dash 25 space done dash 10. And now what we do, we run a little regex on the string, and we're simply looking for the string progress, followed by a dash, then by any amount of numbers, and we capture those numbers in a group, and the return value, which is essentially the 25 as a string, we're going to return into the parsing function, which then turns it into an integer. So that's how we, for example, can read the progress. All right, let's say we want to write to the micro format. And we're going to use the same example of trying to write to test.progress. So how do we encode a, let's say, a progress value of 75? Well, this is one way to do it. The first thing we do is we find the progress anchor in the DOM by, again, using the task ID and then finding the a.progress element up here. We then get the class from this progress element and save it in a variable CLS. Then we change the progress attribute class, meaning the string up there, and we basis off the value of the CLS variable we just saved. So the only thing we do with it is we replace the progress dash 25, in this case a regex matching any number, so progress, yeah?
So I was just wondering how you task dash 4885 there. I don't see how it's putting that out of the link.
It's all the HTML isn't showing.
No, it's not all the HTML. I'm going to recap in a second. So actually, this anchor is encoded in a TR element. The TR element has the ID test minus 4885. That's a little confusing, sorry. And so what we do with the CLS variable is we essentially replace this string right here by matching it with the regex with our new progress value over there, which essentially is progress dash 75. And which then changes the value in the DOM to 75. And now we did something pretty cool. We took a value from the DOM, read it, and we put it back into the DOM. So we can essentially change anything that we have encoded in our HTML and keep the semantics we are using. All right. Yeah.
You're looking at that CLS. I didn't. Are you adding an action to it?
Oh, actually, this should reach class.
Oh.
If that lost you.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, just saw that. Okay, now let's have a look at the Jadm way of semantic encoding. As you saw, all of the stuff was a little verbose, and since we are going to do it a lot, there should be a shorter way of doing it. Well, Jadm comes with a little function called Semantic, and what it does, it's simply doing the same regex and stuff. It's just generalizing it. So you just say you want the progress value out of any sort of string, which is encoded by progress dash any sort of number, and this is what's going to return it to you. This kind of beats the previous version because it's a lot shorter. And we can do the similar thing for setting the progress by simply calling this semantic function, which is the jQuery plugin, and setting it to 75, which beats our little class approach down there. All right. Now that we've done this, now that makes this actually useful and not just a little demonstration of what JavaScript can do. And let's have a look at this. What we're doing here is the following. We essentially find all TR elements, meaning table rows, that have the class task. That means we find all elements in the DOM that represent a task in any sort of way. Then we define that all tasks have some fields that are common to them. So one of these fields, we're only defining one in this example, is progress. And in order to get the progress, we have a get function. In this get function, we simply return what I just showed you. We find the a.progress element inside the table row, and we return the semantic progress. For setting the progress, we do something similar. We take a value parameter, we find the progress element, and we call the semantic function setting it. So now what does this allow us to do? Now that we define what a task is and what field it has, we can make our life a lot more easier. by simply finding the tab. Actually, this is wrong. I mentioned that a.process is not there. Sorry. Finished the slide like 2 minutes ago before I gave this off. So let's imagine we just find the task ID, and what this does is once we found the task with ID 4885 and we call the field function, it goes back to what we defined up there, meaning the get function, and returns us the progress value of the task which is dealing with. Same goes for static stuff. We simply, the wrong selector again, we simply call the field function, we set the progress to 75, and in return it will go to this function up here and semantically encode the progress value into DOM. So this is a quite comfortable way of getting data into the DOM and getting it back out of it.
Okay, question. Do you have to define that every time for every microformat you create?
Define what?
All the
fields?
Yeah, the fields and the one before, semantic.
No,
semantic is just
semantic is a generalized function.
Okay.
That you can use everywhere.
Yeah.
Yes. The fields for every microformat you use, you have to define again, but there's nothing keeping you from having one hash object holding all the fields you're commonly using and just referencing those when you define your field function or your field hash right up here with the field function. So code reusage is given. Depends on how you use it. It makes it life harder than necessary. Yeah.
On the semantic function, the only valid values, I guess, are numeric, is the way you said it?
No, the way it's encoded is actually accepting any value other than a white space. That means as soon as the white space is coming after the dash, it's considering the encoded value to be over. So this means it's only meant for encoding simple values. If you have something more complex, you should use Jadm encoding it somewhere for the real complex stuff, or in most cases there's an HTML way of expressing it. Let's say you define it as the text of an HTML element, or let's say you can use other attributes like rels and things like that. I'm going to have some examples with different types of values. Other questions so far? All right. Let's have a look at a real-world example. Well, this is what I use in PostGres. It's the field definition of the task. But don't worry, it's going to get easy. Here's an example of the microformat we just looked at. And I'm going to tell you how this microformat actually translates to real application. Essentially, we have the task ID encoded up here, as I've shown before. Well, this is how we can get embedded. We define a field function, as we've seen before, and this is the ID column we set in. We have the function get, which essentially returns the semantic value encoded in the attribute ID, which is a different way of calling the semantic function, which means you cannot only use it on class attribute who works on any attribute, but by default it thinks it's a class attribute that's meant. And you also have the set function. So this is how you get an ID from DOM and back in there. Then we have the task.date, which is essentially the same thing. We just this time, instead of using the ID attribute, we use the rel attribute to get stuff in the DOM and out of it with the get and set function. Then there's the progress, which in our case is a little bit more complicated. You can see the progress function is really simplistic. It's what it's doing is the element progress has been saved somewhere before. We get it out of the L progress function, which is essentially the same as running the queries we saw before. It finds the anchor with the class progress, and then we call the semantic function on it. The set function below is a little bit more complex to explain, but essentially what it does is it sets the progress bar visually. It moves the green background up and down, so you can visually see the progress. It encodes the progress in the class, so we can read it. And it also sets the title to have like a help text for the user when he's hovering over the A element, so he's getting some feedback on what the progress is and how much time total is left. Done. Should be simple again. I'm done. which is just a simple get function. And the only thing that's fancy going on with that function is, again, setting a help text, which is done by converting the Mindy's value into a human readable string. But that's specific to our application and nothing you need to worry about. The next thing is, for example, the time total, which is a different example to what we've seen so far. Instead of encoding our value inside an attribute, we actually have the text encapsulated in an anchor, but it's still the same kind of stuff. We find the element, which is done using the element time function, which is one I unfortunately can't cover today, but essentially what it does is find this anchor up here, and it then just simply takes the text from it, and it replaces non-digit symbols, and then runs it through a function called toMinutes, which essentially converts it into an integer containing toMinutes. So 1:00 would return 60 minutes. And the set function is doing the same thing, just in reverse. And well, last but not least, and a really simple one, is the task name, which is actually just a plain text encoded in the anchor value. And it's really simple example. You find the name element, which is this anchor up there, and you return the text. Over setting it, you set the text. That's basic jQuery. Alright, back to world domination. Why are we doing all this difficult, weird stuff? There's got to be a real advantage of being so anal about semantics and having everything in the DOM and not in JavaScript. Why not use a simple render function for all of that? Well, the real cool thing is once you define the semantics of your document and all the microformats contained in it, then what Jadm does, it modifies the jQuery selector engine in a way that's not harmful or interfering with anything else it does, and allows you to do some really cool things. For example, instead of just being able to query DOM elements, you can now query by semantics. You can, for example, write a selector like this. Find the old tag, where the name is new tag. Now jQuery knows what the name field is. It knows how to get the name out of the tag, and also knows how to set the name, for example. Another example. Find the old tag, where the process is more than 50%. So all your business logic is now really nice and readable once you get to the point where you define the semantics. So it's not a real pain in the ass with your HTML changes at one point, because all of the things that are relevant to the user and what he sees when things are changing is independent of the HTML. You completely remove the markup dependency on the business logic of your JavaScript, which is a real advantage when it comes to refactoring and things like that. Here's one of my favorite examples, which is a little complicated. Essentially, it's a real-on jQuery selector that uses several things that Jadm does. What does it do? First of all, it finds all posts. Posts are just microformat response, the base response post. Then it makes sure that all of these posts have at least one comment written by myself. This is done by the head selector, jQuery, so you can actually leverage all the jQuery stuff and combine it with the Jadm selector. So we're saying find us all posts that have a comment with also Felix. And then we add a last condition to it. We want to make sure that this post is visible. So we do not see any posts that are hidden because they're not relevant to what we're looking for. And this is the point where our semantics actually become useful. And it's not just something we do to please web standards and to get clients to think we're all super web developers. It's something that's going to be a real advantage when we develop our business logic. Well, another advantage that comes with this is EDA check. Now that you know, or the JavaScript knows, how your document is structured and what the semantics are, it can completely extract any record that it sees on the screen, encode it into JSON, and send it to your server. This is done like this. For example, we write a selector, find the first tag on the screen. Now that we have been selected, we call the save function, which is provided by Jadm. And what it does is the following. It essentially sends a post to the server. And this post is just a simple HTML post. It goes to /tag/edit, then the ID of the tag, and then it's using .json, which essentially makes it go through parse extensions and Yadm, but Yadm is not supporting the new REST stuff yet. So
that's okay.
It's still done the old way. In the new Cake 1.2.4, you can probably use /test/id.json directly. Is that right?
Yep.
And use put instead of the post to update the record.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, in this case, we're still a little bit old school, but I hope you don't mind. Essentially, what Jadm has done for us is use the definitions of all the fields that make up a test. It extracted the values from the DOM, and it put it into the post and sent it to the server. Now, let's run this again real quick. Yeah, that's what I wanted to show. Now, what the server does, it recognizes that we are this time doing an AJAX request and not simply calling the page using our web browser. And so it's smart enough to send us back JSON instead of HTML. The JSON simply contains all the stuff we already sent to the server, but it's basically done to make sure that the client and the server stay in sync. So after the server updates the test in the database, it returns what it has just updated. And in case, for example, there was a restriction, like let's say validation failed, it will only return what actually got saved. And so the DOM element essentially is updated again to reflect the current state of the server, rather than what you think the server is having based on what you sent. So you can, there's also some stuff to handle validation logic. If the server thinks some field didn't validate, it could be truncated to validate, then it's going to let Jadm know. Jadm is going to throw an error, and you can handle that in the application by catching the event of it. Alright, what are some of the other advantages of using Jadm? Well, as we said already, it puts your Jadm, your semantics to use. It saves you a ton of bandwidth and server call, because you're now using simple post requests and simple JSON. No more returning HTML strings, replacing them in your DOM, and then being all pissed because suddenly none of the events are working anymore, none of the links you're clicking is found. I mean, there's live query. Anybody who's worked with that before here? Yeah. I mean, it's one solution, but you probably noticed there's like no perfect way to do this right now. Jadm has a lot of stuff built in that when you define your microformat, you also define what elements are inside this microformat and what events to bind to those. So when you create a new task, for example, in Jadm, what happens is it already assigns all the event handlers to it. When you delete a task, it removes them. If you update a task, you make sure they don't get spawned 2 times, things like that. So basically all the event problems you've come across before when doing dynamic AJAX, Jadm is going to handle for you. And it essentially removes all the hassle between client and server communication. You just tell them I got a task, the task has the following values, send it to the server, and the server is going to return you the JSON, saying I'm happy with what you just sent me, or it's not working. And then you can catch the error and display it to the user. So keep an eye on jadm.org, which is where I'm going to release this. It's not quite done yet, but it should be like a week away or something like that. Questions so far? I'm probably, since I got some time left, I'm probably going to show them stuff directly in the browser so you can see how you use it. But any questions so far? Yeah?
I already mentioned it yesterday to you. The biggest problem I have, if you want to build something which is really accessible, then you have your templates twice. You have your templates on the server for Cake, and you also have that microformat defined in your JavaScript, and it's just duplicated HTML layout. So it's kind of hard to maintain both.
Well, Thibaut knows more than he should be knowing. I didn't show all parts of Jadm, and one part is where you actually define how does a new fresh task look, or how does a new post look, and how I do this is simply by defining the HTML. I'm going to show it in my editor in just a second. And well, the solution I told you I would use is to take the set JSON I just showed, encode the HTML in a JSON string, and then reference it from there, and you make your definition. So you get the HTML from CakePHP and no duplication of logic. So I guess that should work.
Yeah.
More questions? Yep.
I've seen a JavaScript validation library that uses class names to attach behavior to your input fields. Could something like that be adapted to this, where you actually pull the validation rules from?
You want to validate on the client side?
Yes, using the defined cake validation rules.
Oh, using the cake rules?
No. I'm asking that in your model you define your validation rules. Would there be a way to pass those rules to the front end using class names? Have you thought about doing something like that? Attaching validation behavior to your form elements using class names.
Are you trying to catch the validation error without making an Ajax call, meaning directly in JavaScript?
Yes.
No, that's the problem Jadm does not tackle right now, and probably won't, because there's, like Mark mentioned it in his talk, there's a problem with client-side validation, where you have the rules in JavaScript. Mainly you code how you validate. Now, of course, you can use simplified rules for your front end and make it less of a concern. And just like, for example, validate an email address, something that's too obvious even for a hacker to be like, oh, they probably do something weird on the server so I can hack into it. I mean, the email address is a good example for that. But you can combine Jadm with any sort of client-side validation library you find out there. But I would definitely not merge it into the project because it's simply a problem you don't always need to tackle. I mean, an Ajax call is pretty cheap and will tell you for sure when it's been wrong, and you have no duplication of logic. So I would only use like client-side validation for like a sign-up form and just check like the email if people don't submit useless requests to the server that I know will fail before they do it.
The other issue is that in 1.2 cake validation is the validation rules is so complex.
Yeah.
And there's so much dynamic stuff you can do where it's really not just like a static regular expression string.
Yeah,
it's
like
really
for
hard
example,
to replicate that.
take like credit card validation where you have like a Loon algorithm. I don't know if such thing exists in JavaScript, but it's a little bit more trivial than running a regex on a string. And so if you really want to like put logic like this into the JavaScript, you're probably gonna make your life harder than necessary and not enhance the user feeling of the application too much.
I think that it has its place in the fact that the little check boxes and it's kind of comforting and hand-holding to the user because you want some feedback to them in some cases. I think live validation has its merits, but you don't have to just some basic stuff.
What I'm saying is like there's good plugins out there for it already.
Right.
Yearn has like a plugin, right?
Yeah, that's what I was using.
Yeah, and for example, you can use any validation plugin you find out there, lay it over a form, and then the moment where the plugin says it's okay to go, send the form, let Jadm take over and submit the form to the server and see what actually happens. So there's nothing in there that would conflict with using other plugins and other code you already have.
I just had an idea. We had a talk about SOAP and Jadm for lunch, and one thing when I communicate with the server from the client, I always use Jadm. Also, if I just render a server-side view, I have attribute in the Jadm literal I give back, which is called content, and there's the HTML string. And I render that but it's always the Jadm literal. So because I want some things like I don't know, the French guy mentioned. It was that you want to know if something happened on the server, like an exception on the server or validation not. I have this metadata, and I also have this rendered content, and I also have a data field where there are the form fields, the view fields you set in your controller inside. It would be nice to just have one layout like this in Cake. Like you use this literal, Jamal is using the same Jadm literal. We just find something which is good for both.
It would be nice. What I'm doing in Shape is I essentially, if like the AJAX request doesn't fail, meaning if it doesn't time out, if it doesn't return like an obvious 4.4, 4.3 response, or 500 internal server error, in this case I look at the JSON being sent back, and I look if there's a key set called error, and I look for error without the first letter in capital. That means it's not a model. The model will always be the first letter in capital. So if this key is set in the return JSON, then I have the message in there, and I will leave like a status that tells me what went wrong. For example, set validation. Then it has like a message which is string saying what fields did fail. Or you could go fancy and like have an array encoded inside the error object, telling you all the fields that failed and what went wrong. I believe I did that at 1.2.
I have kind of similar conventions, but different.
Yeah, but we should, maybe it would be a good idea if we could, like, for example, I think what CakePHP would benefit from would be some form of like that JSON function, because it's just something you sometimes need, and also like some way of handling errors in JSON. I mean, but CakePHP's error handling could be also better if we had THP5, which is like exceptions in general, so it's a little hard. I wouldn't know how to like really smoothly integrate it and what's in there before with like take error, validation errors and stuff like that. But we should think about it. Any other comments?
I just wanted to ask, well, first of all, I'm very excited about the things you're doing. I can't wait to see the product launch and check it out. My question has more to do with application architecture, like you organize your JavaScript within, for instance,
within
stack.
Yeah.
Or within, well, see, my understanding of Jadm is it's going to be a JavaScript file that completes certain tasks for you, but as far as your application JavaScript, because you're going to put Jadm on top of that, and then you're going to have your application JavaScript working with Jadm, correct?
Actually, no. With I'll show it to you in a second. I think
I'm really just interested in
how the JavaScript
JavaScript file looks like. I think it's for everything.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move to the code. Let's get over.
Move to the code.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening, and well, thanks a lot for all of you for helping the CakePHP project grow by showing up here and by hopefully submitting tickets and stuff in the future, providing tests so Nate doesn't freak out. And thanks for being here. And the site will be available on cakephp.org shortly.